Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on chapter 138. Chapter 138. Does it ever happen to you, said Natasha to her brother when they settled down in the sitting room, does it ever happen to you to feel as if there was nothing more to come, nothing, that everything good is past? And to feel not exactly dull, but sad? I should think so, he replied. I have felt like that when everything was all right and everyone was cheerful. The thought has come into my mind that I was already tired of it all, and that we all must die. Once, in the regiment, I had not gone to some merrymaking when there was music, and suddenly I felt so depressed. Oh yes, I know, Natasha interrupted him. When I was quite little, that used to be so with me. Do you remember when I was punished, once about some plums? You were all dancing, and I sat sobbing in the schoolroom. I shall never forget it. I felt sad and sorry for everyone, for myself, and for everyone. And I was innocent. That was the chief thing, said Natasha. Do you remember? I remember, answered Nicholas. I remember that I came to you afterwards and wanted to comfort you, but I felt so ashamed to. We were terribly absurd. I had a funny doll then and wanted to give it to you. Do you remember? And do you remember, Natasha asked with a pensive smile, how long ago, long ago, when we were quite little, Uncle called us into the study? That was in the old house, and it was dark. We went in, and suddenly there stood... A Negro, chimed in Nicholas with a smile of delight. Of course I remember. Even now I don't know whether there was really a Negro or if we only dreamed about it and were told about him. He was gray, you remember, and had white teeth and stood and looked at us. Sonia, do you remember? Asked Nicholas. Yes, I do remember something too, Sonia answered timidly. You know I have asked Papa and Mama about that Negro, said Natasha, and they say there was no Negro at all, but you see, you remember. Of course I do. I remember his teeth as if I had just seen them. How strange it is. It's as if it were all a dream. I like that. And do you remember how we rolled hard-boiled eggs in the ballroom, and suddenly two old women began spinning around on the carpet? Was that real or not? Do you remember what fun it was? Yes, and I remember how Papa in his blue overalls fired a gun at the porch. So they went through their memories, smiling with pleasure. Not the sad memories of old age, but poetic, youthful ones. Those impressions of one's most distant past in which dreams and realities blend. And they laughed with quiet enjoyment. Sonia, as always, did not quite keep pace with them, though they shared the same reminiscences. Much that they remembered had slipped from their mind, and what she recalled did not arouse the same poetic feeling as they experienced. She simply enjoyed their pleasure and tried to fit in with it. She only really took part when they recalled Sonia's first arrival. She told them how afraid she had been of Nicholas because he had on a corded jacket, and her nurse had told her that she too would be sewn up with cords. And I remember their telling me that you had been born under cabbage, said Natasha. And I remember that I dared not disbelieve it then, but knew that it was not true, and I felt so uncomfortable. While they were talking, a maid thrust her head in at the door of the sitting room. They have brought the cock, miss, she said in a whisper. It isn't wanted, Polya. Tell them to take it away, replied Natasha. In the middle of their talk in the sitting room, Dimmler came in and went up to the harp that stood there in a corner. He took off its cloth covering, and the harp gave out a jarring sound. "Mr. Dimmler, please play my favorite nocturne by Field," came the old countess's voice from the drawing room. Dimmler struck a chord, and turning to Natasha, Nicholas, and Sonia, remarked, "How quiet you young people are." "Yes, we're philosophizing," said Natasha, glancing round for a moment, and then continuing the conversation. They were now discussing dreams. Dimmler began to play. Natasha went on tiptoe noiselessly to the table, took up a candle, carried it out, and returned seating herself quietly in her former place. It was dark in the room, especially where they were sitting on the sofa, but through the big windows the silvery light of the full moon fell on the floor. Dimmler had finished the piece, but still sat softly running his fingers over the strings, evidently uncertain whether to stop or to play something else. "Do you know," said Natasha in a whisper, moving closer to Nicholas and Sonia, "that when one goes on recalling memories, one at last begins to remember what happened before one was even born?" "That is metempsychosis," said Sonia, who had always learned well and remembered everything. "The Egyptians believe that our souls have lived in animals, and we will go back to animals again." "No, I don't believe we were ever animals," said Natasha, still in a whisper, though the music had ceased. "But I am certain that we were angels somewhere, and we've been here before, and that is why we remember." "May I join you?" said Dimmler, who had come up quietly and sat down by them. "If we have been angels, why haven't we fallen lower?" said Nicholas. "No, that can't be." "Not lower? Who said we were lower? How do I know what I was before?" Natasha rejoined with conviction. "The soul is immortal. Well then, if I shall always live, I have always lived before. Live for whole eternity." "Yes, but it is hard for us to imagine eternity," remarked Dimmler, who had joined the young folk with a mildly condescending smile, but now spoke as quietly and seriously as they. "Why is it hard to imagine eternity?" said Natasha. "It is now today, and it will be tomorrow, and always. And it was yesterday and the day before." "Natasha, now is not your turn. Sing me something," they heard the countess say. "Why are you sitting there like conspirators?" "Mamma, I don't want at all to," replied Natasha. But all the same, she rose. None of them, not even the middle-aged Dimmler, wanted to break off their conversation and quit the corner in the sitting room. But Natasha got up, and Nicholas sat down at the clavichord. Standing as usual in the middle of the hall, and choosing a place where the resonance was best, Natasha began to sing her mother's favorite song. She had said she did not want to sing, but it was long since she had sung, and long before she again sang, as she did that evening. The Count, from his study where he was talking to Matinka, heard her, and like a schoolboy in a hurry to run out to play, blundered in his talk while giving orders to the steward, and at last stopped, while Matinka stood in front of him, also listening and smiling. Nicholas did not take his eyes off his sister, and drew breath in time with her. Sonia, as she listened, thought of the immense difference there was between herself and her friend, and how impossible it was for her to be anything like as bewitching as her cousin. The old countess sat with a blissful yet sad smile, and with tears in her eyes, occasionally shaking her head. She thought of Natasha and of her own youth, and of how there was something unnatural and dreadful in this impending marriage of Natasha and Prince Andrew. Dimmler, who had seated himself beside the countess, listened with closed eyes. "Ah, Countess," he said at last, "that's a European talent. She has nothing to learn but softness, tenderness, and strength." How afraid I am for her, how afraid I am," said the countess, not realizing to whom she was speaking. Her maternal instinct told her that Natasha had too much of something, and that because of this she would not be happy. Before Natasha had finished singing, 14-year-old Petya rushed in delightedly to say some murmurs had arrived. Natasha stopped abruptly. "Idiot!" she screamed to her brother, and running to a chair threw herself on it, sobbing so violently that she could not stop for a long time. "It's nothing, Mamma, really it's nothing. Only Petya startled me," she said, trying to smile, but her tears still flowed and sobs still choked her. The mummers, some of the house serfs, dressed up as bears, Turks, innkeepers, and ladies, frightening and funny, bringing in with them the cold from outside, and a feeling of gaiety, crowded, at first timidly into the anteroom, then hiding behind one another, they pushed into the ballroom, where, shyly at first, and then more and more merrily and heartily, they started singing, dancing, and playing Christmas games. The Countess, when she had identified them and laughed at their costumes, went into the drawing room. The Count sat in the ballroom, smiling radiantly and applauding the players. The young people had disappeared. Half an hour later there appeared among the other mummers in the ballroom an old lady in a hoop skirt. This was Nicholas. A Turkish girl was Petya, a clown was Demler, an hussar was Natasha, and a Circassian was Sonia with burnt cork mustache and eyebrows. After the condescending surprise, non-recognition, and praise from those who were not themselves dressed up, the young people decided that their costumes were so good that they ought to be shown elsewhere. Nicholas, who, as the roads were in splendid condition, wanted to take them all for a drive in his troika, prepared to take them, about a dozen of the serf mummers, and drive to Uncle's. "No, why disturb the old fellow?" said the Countess. "Besides, you won't have room to turn around there. If you must go to the Melyukovs." Melyukova was a widow who, with her family and their tutors and governesses, lived 3 miles from the Rostovs. "That's right, my dear," chimed in the old Count, thoroughly aroused. "I'll dress up at once and go with them. I'll make Pashette open her eyes." But the Countess would not agree to his going. He had had a bad leg all these last days. It was decided that the Count must not go, but if that Louisa Ivanovna, Madame Schosch, would go with them. The young ladies might go to the Melyukovas, Sonia, generally so timid and shy, more urgently than anyone, begging Louisa Ivanovna not to refuse. Sonia's costume was the best of all. Her mustache and eyebrows were extraordinarily becoming. Everyone told her she looked very handsome, and she was in a spirited and energetic mood as usual. Some inner voice told her that now or never her fate would be decided, and in her male attire she seemed quite a different person. Louisa Ivanovna consented to go, and in half an hour 4 troika sleighs with large and small bells, their runners squeaking and whistling over the frozen snow, drove up to the porch. Natasha was foremost in setting a merry holiday tone, which, passing from one to another, grew stronger and reached its climax when they all came out into the frost and got into the sleighs, talking, calling to one another, laughing, and shouting. 2 of the troikas were the usual household sleighs. The third was the old Count's, with a trotter from Orlov's stud as a shaft horse. The fourth was Nicholas's own, with a short, shaggy black shaft horse. Nicholas, in his old lady's dress, over which he had belted his hussar overcoat, stood in the middle of the sleigh, reins in hand. It was so light that he could see the moonlight reflected from the metal harness discs and from the eyes of the horses, who looked round in alarm at the noisy party under the shadow of the porch roof. Natasha, Sonia, Madame Schoss, and 2 maids got into Nicholas's sleigh. Demler, his wife, and Petya, into the old Count's, and the rest of the murmur seated themselves in the 2 other sleighs. "You go ahead, Zakhar," shouted Nicholas to his father's coachman, wishing for a chance to race past him. The old Count's troika, with Demler and his party, started forward, squeaking on its runners as though freezing to the snow, its deep-toned bell clanging. The side horses, pressing against the shafts of the middle horse, sank in the snow, which was dry and glittered like sugar, and threw it up. Nicholas set off. Following the first sleigh, behind him the others moved noisily, their runners squeaking. At first they drove at a steady trot along the narrow road. While they drove past the garden, the shadows of the bare trees often fell across the road and hid the brilliant moonlight. But as soon as they were past the fence, the snowy plain, bathed in moonlight and motionless, spread out before them, glittering like diamonds and dappled with bluish shadows. Bang, bang, went the first sleigh over a cradle hole in the snow of the road, and each of the other sleighs jolted in the same way. And rudely breaking the frost-bound stillness, the troikas began to speed along the road, one after the other. "A hare's track! A lot of tracks!" rang out Natasha's voice through the frost-bound air. "How light it is, Nicholas!" came Sonia's voice. Nicholas glanced around at Sonia, and bent down to see her face closer. Quite a new, sweet face, with black eyebrows and mustaches, peeped up at him from under her sable furs, so close and yet so distant in the moonlight. That used to be Sonia, thought he, and looked at her closer and smiled. What is it, Nicholas? Nothing, said he, and turned again to the horses. When they came out onto the beaten high road, polished by sleigh runners and cut up by rough-shod hoofs, the marks of which were visible in the moonlight, the horses began to tug at the reins of their own accord and increase their pace. The near side horse, arching his head and breaking into a short canter, tugged at his traces. The shaft horse swayed from side to side, moving his ears as if asking, "Isn't it time to begin now?" In front, already far ahead, the deep bell of the sleigh ringing farther and farther off, the black horses driven by Zakhar could be clearly seen against the white snow. From that sleigh, one could hear the shouts, laughter, and voices of the mummers. "Gee up, my darlings!" shouted Nicholas, pulling the reins to one side and flourishing his whip. It was only by the keener wind that met them, and the jerks given by the side horses who pulled harder, ever increasing their gallop, that one noticed how fast the troika was flying. Nicholas looked back. With screams, squeals, and waving of whips that caused even the shaft horses to gallop, the other sleighs followed. The shaft horse swung steadily beneath the bow over his head, with no thought of slackening pace, and ready to put on speed when required. Nicholas overtook the first sleigh. They were driving downhill and coming out upon a broad-trodden track across a meadow near a river. "Where are we?" thought he. "It's the Kursoy meadow, I suppose. But no, this is something new I've never seen before. This isn't the Kursoy meadow, nor the Dimkin hill. Heaven only knows what it is. It is something new and enchanted. Well, whatever it may be." And shouting to his horses, he began to pass the first sleigh. Zakhar held back his horses and turned his face, which is already covered with hoarfrost, to his eyebrows. Nicholas gave the horses the rein, and Zakhar, stretching out his arms, clucked his tongue and let his horses go. "Now, look out, master!" he cried. Faster still, the two troikas flew side by side, and faster moved the feet of the galloping side horses. Nicholas began to draw ahead. Zakhar, while still keeping his arms extended, raised one hand with the reins. "No, you won't, master," he shouted. Nicholas put all his horses to a gallop and passed Zakhar. The horses showered the fine, dry snow on the faces of those in the sleigh. Beside them sounded quick ringing bells, and they caught confused glimpses of swiftly moving legs and the shadows of the troika they were passing. The whistling sound of the runners on the snow and the voices of girls shrieking were heard from different sides. Again checking his horses, Nicholas looked round him. They were still surrounded by the magic plain, bathed in moonlight and spangled with stars. "Zakhar is shouting that I should turn to the left, but why go to the left?" thought Nicholas. "Aren't we getting to the Melikovs? Isn't this Melikova? Heaven only knows where we are going, and heaven knows what is happening to us, but it is very strange and pleasant, whatever it is." And he looked round in the sleigh. "Look, his mustaches and eyelashes are all white," said one of the strange, pretty unfamiliar people, the one with fine eyebrows and mustache. "I think this used to be Natasha," thought Nicholas, "and that was Madame Schosch. But perhaps it's not. And there's Circassian with the mustache. I don't know, but I love her." "Aren't you cold?" he asked. They did not answer, but began to laugh. Dimmler from the sleigh shouted something, probably something funny, but they could not make out what he said. "Yes, yes," some voices answered, laughing. But here was a fairy forest with black moving shadows, and a glitter of diamonds, and a flight of marble steps, and the silver roofs of fairy buildings, and the shrill yells of some animals. And if this really is Melikovka, it is still stranger that we drove heaven knows where and have come to Melikovka, thought Nicholas. It really was Melikovka, and maids and footmen with merry faces came running out to the porch carrying candles. "Who is it?" asked someone in the porch. "The murmurs from the counts. I know by the horses," replied some voices. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 138. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 138. Met him, Picosus. I sailed with thee along the Peruvian coast last voyage. In a sense, there is only one book, though it takes many forms. Much like Sonia's Egyptian's transmigration of souls from animal to human and into animal again, the human experience is expressed here in one book and there in another. That is why Mortimer Adler's and Charles Van Doren's method of syntopical reading, the search for understanding and knowledge through the critical analysis of two or more books on the same subject, is such a fruitful practice. By comparing and contrasting multiple sources, our comprehension of any given subject is more deeply illuminated. William Blake, that master of illumination, speaks to today's theme, the passing of the innocence of childhood and the coming of dreadful experience, in his poem Night. In that poem, innocence is preserved by the vigilant protection of angels. This protection is so absolute that even lions may lie with lambs, and the peace is preserved. The parallels to the Rostov siblings are clear. For a while now, we've been building up to their transition to adulthood. We started out with them in raw childhood as they innocently chased a toy into the thick of their parents' party. Now, with Nicholas already having been to war, and Natasha engaged to be married, we find them on the cusp of adulthood. This transformation is reflected in the transitional nature of the recent chapters. It's Christmas time, we're approaching the new year, and winter has covered the earth in forgetful snow, its future thaw promising a new day. There are further parallels. Blake places Night as the final of the Innocence poems. Tolstoy, likewise, closes out the Rostov's children's childhood in the final chapters of Book 2 of this novel. Remember that in A Year of War and Peace edition, these breaks have been removed. What follows in Blake is the fearful experience of the chimney sweeper, the sick Rose, in London. There are challenges, marks of weakness, mark of woe, in the mail for the Rostov children too, as War and Peace progresses. They don't appear to be ready for it. They're still content to live as if they're under the protection of Blake's innocent angels. They spend the first half of today's chapter happily reminiscing about their childhood and smiling with pleasure over their memories. It'd be foolish to count on the everlasting protection of Blake's angels. Eventually, experience comes knocking. A Year of War and Peace has spoken before of the benefits of negative visualization as a tool to prepare oneself for the hard knocks of life. We'll do it again, in the hopes that it helps the Rostovs as they venture forward into experience. They're going to need it. Things are about to get pretty bad. Daily Meditation. A man who paints everything black, who constantly fears the worst and takes measures accordingly, will not be disappointed so often in this world as one who always looks upon the bright side of things. Author Schopenhauer, The Wisdom of Life. All right, so that concludes my reading and reflection on chapter 138. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are below in the show notes. Tomorrow we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 139. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.